Sarah tapped her manicured nails on the steering wheel, a nervous habit she couldn't seem to shake. The sun beat down on her beat-up Honda Civic, baking the interior like an oven. It was a stark contrast to the lives of the people she resented most, Mark's family. They lived in sprawling mansions, drove luxury cars, and seemed to have money to burn. Money that Sarah desperately needed. She glanced at the small, worn envelope on the passenger seat. Inside was a list, a rundown of Mark's family's assets, their weaknesses, their routines. She had spent weeks gathering this information, each stolen glance at a financial statement, each overheard conversation fueling her growing resentment. It wasn't fair, she thought. She worked tirelessly, juggling 2 jobs just to make ends meet, while they lived a life of effortless luxury. Mark, sweet, oblivious Mark, loved her. He didn't understand her financial struggles, he'd never had to worry about where his next meal was coming from. He saw her as ambitious and driven, not desperate and resentful. That's why he wouldn't suspect a thing. He'd be devastated, of course, but ultimately, he'd do anything to get her back. And that anything included tapping into his family's considerable wealth. Her plan was audacious, bordering on insane, but Sarah was past the point of caring. She was tired of playing by the rules, tired of struggling while others lived the high life. She was going to take what she deserved, or at least, what she thought she deserved. The plan was simple: stage her own abduction, demand a hefty ransom from Mark's family, and disappear with the money. The seed of the idea had been planted months ago, during a late-night movie marathon. A cheesy thriller about a fake kidnapping had sparked something in her mind. At first, it was just a fleeting thought, a ridiculous fantasy. But the more she thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. She researched abduction cases, studying the tactics used by kidnappers, the psychology of victims, and the procedures followed by law enforcement. She knew it was risky, but the potential reward outweighed the risk, in her mind. Sarah pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel, the kind of place where people went to disappear. She checked into a room under a fake name, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The first step in her elaborate plan. The hardest part was still to come, making it all believable. She had to convince Mark's family that she was in real danger, that her life was on the line. And she had to do it without Mark ever suspecting that she was the mastermind behind it all. The weight of the deception settled on her shoulders, heavy and suffocating. But she pushed it aside, focusing on the end goal, freedom from financial worry. Soon, she would have enough money to start over, to live the life she had always dreamed of. The motel room was depressing, stained carpets, peeling wallpaper, and a musty odor that clung to everything. But it was only a temporary base of operations. The real stage for her performance was the Airbnb she'd booked, a secluded cabin nestled in the woods, far from prying eyes. She'd chosen it carefully, ensuring there were no security cameras and minimal neighbors. Privacy was paramount. Over the next few days, Sarah transformed the cabin into a convincing crime scene. She ransacked the place, scattering clothes, overturning furniture, and even smearing a bit of fake blood, corn syrup and red food coloring, a trick she'd learned from her movie research, on the walls. She wanted it to look like a violent struggle had taken place, a desperate fight for survival. She spent hours crafting the ransom note, using a cut-and-paste method to avoid leaving any identifiable handwriting. The words were carefully chosen, designed to instill fear and urgency. She demanded a large sum of money, enough to set her up for life, and provided specific instructions for the drop-off, making it clear that any deviation would result in her disappearance. The most challenging part was recording the proof of life video. Sarah had to act terrified, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with tears. She practiced her lines repeatedly, trying to capture the perfect balance of fear and desperation. It felt disgusting, manipulating Mark's emotions like this, but she justified it by telling herself it was all for a good cause. She deserved a better life, and this was the only way to get it. To add another layer of authenticity, she purchased a cheap burner phone and used it to send a series of threatening text messages to Mark, further reinforcing the idea that she was being held against her will. She even went so far as to create a fake social media profile for her abductor, posting cryptic messages and disturbing images to create a sense of unease and dread. She made sure to disable her regular phone's location services, or so she thought. Unbeknownst to her, an old location-sharing app she'd used with her ex-boyfriend, David, was still running in the background, silently transmitting her whereabouts. It was a detail she'd completely forgotten, a ticking time bomb that threatened to unravel her entire plan. Satisfied with her preparations, Sarah took one last look around the cabin. It was a mess, a chaotic scene of manufactured violence. But it was also perfect. It was the stage for the performance of her life, the performance that would finally set her free. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the next act. It was time to unleash her plan. She planted some of her hair around the cabin to suggest a struggle. It was time to send the message and wait. The burner phone felt foreign in her hand. It was a cheap, disposable device, purchased with cash from a convenience store on the other side of town. No traceable connections, no digital footprint leading back to her. This was the instrument of her deception, the voice of her fictitious abductor. Taking a deep breath, Sarah typed out the first message, her fingers trembling slightly. "Your girlfriend is with us. Do exactly as we say, or she gets hurt." She attached a grainy photo of herself, bound and gagged, a scene she'd carefully staged earlier that day. It was chillingly effective, even to her. She sent the message to Mark's phone, then immediately powered off the burner phone and removed the SIM card. She wrapped the SIM card in aluminum foil and buried it deep in the woods behind the cabin. She wasn't taking any chances. Next, she sent the ransom note to Mark's father, Robert, a cold and calculating businessman who controlled the family's vast fortune. She knew he wouldn't hesitate to call the police, but she was counting on that. She needed the situation to appear as real as possible. The note was delivered via email, using a temporary, encrypted email address she'd created specifically for this purpose. The subject line was simple: Sarah's life. The body of the email contained the ransom demand, $1 million in unmarked bills, and detailed instructions for the drop-off. She specified a remote location, far from any surveillance cameras or potential witnesses. She warned them not to contact the authorities, threatening to harm Sarah if they did. But she knew they wouldn't listen. They were rich and powerful, they thought they could solve any problem with money and influence. She was counting on their arrogance. As she waited for their response, Sarah felt a strange mix of anxiety and excitement. She was playing a dangerous game, but she was convinced she could pull it off. She had planned every detail, anticipated every possible scenario. She was in control. Or so she thought. The first call came an hour later. It was Robert, his voice cold and demanding. He wanted proof that Sarah was still alive. Sarah played the recording she had made earlier, the one where she pretended to be terrified and begging for help. Robert listened in silence, then hung up without a word. Sarah knew he was trying to assess the situation, to determine whether the threat was real. She had to stay one step ahead of him, to keep him guessing. Over the next few hours, she engaged in a tense back and forth with Robert, negotiating the terms of the ransom and providing occasional, proof-of-life updates. She was careful not to reveal too much, to maintain the illusion of control. She was a puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But the strings were starting to fray. Mark paced frantically in his father's study, his phone pressed to his ear. He'd been on hold with the police for what felt like an eternity. His hands were shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe this was happening. Sarah, kidnapped. It was like something out of a nightmare. He glanced at his father, Robert, who was sitting calmly behind his large mahogany desk, his face impassive. Robert was a man of action, a problem solver. He wouldn't panic, he would assess the situation and take control. But Mark needed reassurance, a sign that everything was going to be okay. "Dad, they're not answering," Mark said, his voice cracking with desperation. "What if something happens to her?" Robert sighed, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "The police are involved, Mark. They're doing everything they can." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But we also need to consider the possibility that this is a hoax." "A hoax?" Mark exclaimed, his voice rising in disbelief. "How can you say that? Sarah's life is at stake." "I'm not saying it is a hoax," Robert replied calmly. "I'm saying we need to consider all possibilities. We can't afford to make any mistakes." Mark knew his father was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He had to do something, anything, to help Sarah. He thought about the ransom demand, the $1 million in unmarked bills. He knew his father had access to that kind of money, but he also knew he wouldn't give it up easily. "We have to pay them, Dad," Mark pleaded. "We can't risk her life over money." Robert remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Mark's shoulder. "I'm talking to the authorities," he said finally. "They have experts who can advise us on how to proceed." Mark knew what that meant. His father was going to let the police take the lead, to handle the situation according to their protocols. But Mark didn't trust the police. He didn't trust anyone except himself. He decided to take matters into his own hands. He remembered Sarah telling him about a savings account she had, a small nest egg she'd been building for years. He knew it wasn't $1 million, but it was a start. He slipped out of the study and headed to his room, his mind racing. He had to find a way to get the money, to convince the kidnappers that he was willing to cooperate. He had to save Sarah, even if it meant defying his father and breaking the law. He knew he had to act fast. He grabbed his laptop and started searching for Sarah's bank details. This was going to be harder than he thought. He felt like he was betraying her trust, but it was for her own good. He hoped she would understand. He repeated to himself, "I'm doing this for you, Sarah." Inside the cabin, Sarah was starting to crack. The isolation was getting to her. The initial thrill of the plan had worn off, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. She hadn't anticipated how difficult it would be to maintain the charade, how much it would take out of her. She spent her days pacing the floor, rehearsing her lines, and monitoring the news for any updates on her kidnapping. She was careful to avoid any contact with the outside world, relying on pre-packaged food and bottled water. The only connection she had was the burner phone, which she used sparingly to communicate with Robert. To pass the time, she started a live stream. It was supposed to be a way to document her ordeal, a kind of twisted performance art. She told herself it was all part of the plan, a way to add another layer of authenticity to her story. But the live stream quickly spiraled out of control. She started ranting about Mark's family, about their wealth and privilege, about the unfairness of it all. She revealed details about their lives, their secrets, their vulnerabilities. It was a dangerous game, but she couldn't stop herself. She justified her actions by telling herself she was exposing the truth, that she was giving a voice to the voiceless. But deep down, she knew she was just lashing out, fueled by anger and resentment. As the days passed, Sarah's appearance deteriorated. She stopped showering, stopped brushing her hair, stopped caring about her surroundings. The cabin became a reflection of her inner turmoil, a chaotic mess of discarded food wrappers, empty water bottles, and crumpled clothing. She started hallucinating, seeing shadows in the corners of the room, hearing voices whispering her name. She was losing her grip on reality, blurring the lines between fact and fiction. One night, during a particularly manic live stream, Sarah revealed too much. She showed a glimpse of the cabin's interior, a detail that could potentially identify its location. She didn't realize it at the time, but it was a fatal mistake. Meanwhile, Mark was growing increasingly desperate. He had managed to access Sarah's bank account, but it only contained a few $1,000s, a far cry from the $1 million ransom demand. He felt helpless, trapped between his love for Sarah and his inability to save her. He started calling her friends, asking them for help, begging them to contribute whatever they could. He even considered selling his own belongings, his car, his apartment, anything to raise the money. He was running out of time, and he knew it. He couldn't believe he was losing her. The pressure was building, both inside and outside the cabin. Sarah's plan was starting to crumble, and Mark was running out of options. The clock was ticking. Hundreds of miles away, in a small apartment cluttered with half-finished projects and empty pizza boxes, David scrolled through his phone. He was a programmer, a creature of habit and routine. Every morning, he checked the same websites, read the same news feeds, and glanced at the same apps. One of those apps was a location-sharing app he had used with Sarah when they were dating. They had broken up months ago, a messy affair fueled by jealousy and miscommunication. But for some reason, David had never deleted the app, never removed Sarah from his contacts. It was a digital ghost, a lingering reminder of a relationship that had ended badly. He hadn't looked at the app in weeks, maybe even months. But today, something compelled him to open it. He clicked on Sarah's name, and a map popped up, displaying her current location. David frowned. The location was far from Sarah's apartment, far from anything he recognized. It was a remote area, deep in the woods. He zoomed in, trying to get a better sense of the surroundings. All he saw was trees, a few scattered houses, and a long, winding road. He dismissed it at first, assuming it was a glitch, a temporary error. But then he remembered seeing a news article online about a woman who had been kidnapped, a woman named Sarah who was the girlfriend of some rich guy. He searched for the article again, skimming through the details. The woman's name was Sarah, her boyfriend was named Mark, and her family was wealthy. It all sounded eerily familiar. He looked back at the map, at the location of the pin marking Sarah's whereabouts. A cold dread washed over him. What if? He knew it was a long shot, a crazy coincidence. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He decided to do some more research, to see if he could find any connections between Sarah's location and the kidnapping. He started searching online for news articles about the kidnapping, focusing on any details about the location where Sarah was last seen. He spent hours poring over maps, comparing addresses, and cross-referencing information. The more he researched, the more convinced he became that Sarah was somehow involved in the kidnapping. The location of the pin on his phone matched the general area where the kidnappers were believed to be holding Sarah. And the fact that Sarah had never mentioned going to this remote area raised even more red flags. David felt a surge of conflicting emotions, disbelief, confusion, and a nagging sense of responsibility. He couldn't be sure, but he had a strong suspicion that Sarah wasn't a victim, but a perpetrator. He picked up his phone, his hand trembling. He knew what he had to do. It was time to call the police. He hoped he was wrong, but he couldn't ignore his gut feeling. Too much was at stake. This was Sarah's life, or someone else's. David hesitated for a moment, his finger hovering over the call button. Was he doing the right thing? What if he was wrong? He imagined the embarrassment, the ridicule, the potential consequences of making a false accusation. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He took a deep breath and pressed the button. The phone rang, each ring amplifying his anxiety. Finally, a voice answered, crisp and professional. 911, what's your emergency? David explained his suspicions to the dispatcher, trying to remain calm and coherent. He told them about the location-sharing app, about Sarah's strange whereabouts, and about the news articles he had read about the kidnapping. The dispatcher listened patiently, asking clarifying questions and taking down notes. She assured David that she would pass his information on to the appropriate authorities. "Sir, I understand your concerns," she said. "But I need to remind you that these are just suspicions. We can't take any action based solely on your word." David understood. He knew he didn't have any concrete evidence, only a hunch based on circumstantial information. But he hoped it would be enough to trigger an investigation. He gave the dispatcher his name and address, then hung up the phone, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. He had done what he could, but now it was out of his hands. Meanwhile, at the police station, Detective Miller listened to the recording of David's phone call. He was a seasoned investigator, a veteran of countless cases. He had seen it all, heard it all. He was skeptical by nature, but he also knew that every lead, no matter how improbable, had to be investigated. He pulled up Sarah's file, reviewing the details of the kidnapping. He noted the ransom demand, the proof of life video, and the ongoing negotiations with Mark's father. He also noted the lack of any concrete evidence, the absence of any witnesses, and the general sense of unease that permeated the case. He decided to check out David's story, to see if there was any merit to his claims. He pulled up the location data from Sarah's phone and compared it to the location provided by David. The two locations matched, almost exactly. Detective Miller felt a prickle of excitement. This could be it, the break they had been waiting for. He assembled a team of officers and prepared to raid the location provided by David. He knew it was a long shot, but he had a feeling they were about to uncover something big. He hoped they weren't too late. The team piled into their cars, sirens silent, and sped towards the woods. They knew they had to be careful. If Sarah was really there, her life could depend on it. They had to approach the cabin with caution and precision, to minimize the risk of any harm coming to her. The stakes were high, and the pressure was on. Detective Miller and his team arrived at the secluded cabin, their vehicles hidden behind a thicket of trees. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. They approached the cabin on foot, their movements slow and deliberate. Detective Miller signaled for his team to surround the cabin. He took a deep breath and knocked loudly on the door. "Police! Open up!" There was no response. He knocked again, louder this time. "Police! We know you're in there. Open the door." Still no response. Detective Miller exchanged a glance with his lieutenant. It was time to breach the door. Two officers stepped forward, armed with a battering ram. They took a few steps back, then charged forward, slamming the ram against the door with all their might. The door splintered and cracked, but it held. They charged again, and this time the door gave way, crashing inward with a loud thud. The officers rushed inside, their weapons drawn. The cabin was a mess, a chaotic scene of overturned furniture, scattered clothing, and empty food containers. The air was thick with a stale, musty odor. Detective Miller followed close behind, his eyes scanning the room. He saw no sign of Sarah, no sign of anyone. "Clear the cabin," he shouted. The officers fanned out, searching every room, every closet, every corner. They found nothing. The cabin was empty. Detective Miller felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. Had they been wrong? Had David's tip been a false alarm? He noticed a laptop sitting on a table in the living room. He approached it cautiously, his hand resting on his weapon. He opened the laptop and saw that it was logged into a live streaming website. He clicked on the live stream and saw a familiar face staring back at him, Sarah. She was sitting in a chair, her eyes wide and unfocused, her hair matted and tangled. She was ranting incoherently about money, about power, about revenge. Detective Miller realized what was happening. Sarah wasn't a victim, she was the perpetrator. She had staged her own kidnapping, and she was broadcasting her confession live for the world to see. He signaled for his team to move in. They surrounded Sarah, their weapons drawn. "Sarah, this is the police," Detective Miller said calmly. "You're under arrest." Sarah looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. "What?" she said, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" "You're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and a number of other charges," Detective Miller said. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The live stream continued to broadcast as the officers placed Sarah in handcuffs and led her out of the cabin. The world watched in stunned silence as Sarah's elaborate plan unraveled before their eyes. Mark watched the stream, stunned and heartbroken. He couldn't believe Sarah would do something like this. He had trusted her, loved her. How could he have been so blind? Robert watched with a grim satisfaction. He had known all along that something was amiss. He had trusted his instincts, and they had paid off. David watched with a mix of relief and guilt. He had done the right thing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had betrayed someone he once cared about. And Sarah, as she was led away in handcuffs, could only stare blankly ahead, her dreams of wealth and freedom shattered, her life in ruins. The only thing she could hear was the sound of her own sobs. Her plan had failed. The news of Sarah's arrest spread like wildfire, dominating headlines and social media feeds. The live stream footage of her confession and arrest was replayed endlessly, dissected and analyzed by armchair detectives and media pundits alike. Mark was devastated. He couldn't reconcile the Sarah he knew, the woman he loved, with the manipulative and deceitful person he had seen on the live stream. He felt betrayed, heartbroken, and utterly foolish. He visited Sarah in jail, hoping for some explanation, some sign of remorse. But all he found was a hollow shell, a woman consumed by bitterness and regret. "Why, Sarah?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do this?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. "You wouldn't understand," she said. "You've always had everything. You've never had to struggle, to fight for what you want." "But this wasn't the way," Mark pleaded. "There were other options. We could have talked, we could have worked things out." "It's too late for that," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "It's all over." Mark left the jail feeling empty and defeated. He had lost Sarah, he had lost his trust, and he had lost his faith in humanity. Robert, on the other hand, felt a sense of vindication. He had always been suspicious of Sarah, had always sensed that she was after his family's money. He was relieved that his instincts had been proven correct, and that his family had been spared from further harm. He issued a statement to the press, expressing his gratitude to the police for their swift action in condemning Sarah's actions in the strongest possible terms. He also made a point of thanking David for his courage and his quick thinking. David, meanwhile, struggled to cope with the aftermath of his actions. He had done the right thing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had played a role in destroying Sarah's life. He received numerous messages of support and gratitude, but he also received a fair share of hate mail and online abuse. Some people accused him of being a jealous ex-boyfriend, others accused him of seeking attention and fame. He tried to ignore the negativity, focusing on the fact that he had helped to prevent a serious crime. But the guilt and the regret lingered, a constant reminder of the complex and unpredictable nature of human relationships. As for Sarah, she faced a long and difficult legal battle. She was charged with multiple felonies, including fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. She faced the possibility of spending many years in prison. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of greed, resentment, and the seductive allure of social media. It was a story that resonated with people around the world, a story that explored the dark side of human nature and the devastating consequences of making the wrong choices. The trial was set to begin in 6 months. The media was already camping outside the courthouse. This was going to be a circus. 6 months later, Sarah's trial began. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the spectacle. Sarah sat at the defense table, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was a shadow of her former self, the confident and ambitious woman she once was. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence against her, including the ransom note, the staged photos, the burner phone records, and the live stream footage. They painted a picture of Sarah as a cold and calculating manipulator, driven by greed and resentment. The defense argued that Sarah was not in her right mind when she planned the kidnapping, that she was suffering from severe emotional distress and financial hardship. They presented testimony from a psychiatrist who claimed that Sarah was suffering from a delusional disorder, that she genuinely believed she was entitled to the money. Mark was called to testify, his face etched with sadness and regret. He recounted his relationship with Sarah, his love for her, and his shock and disbelief when he learned of her deception. "I just don't understand," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "How could she do this? How could she betray me like that?" Robert also testified, his demeanor cold and businesslike. He described his suspicions about Sarah, his concerns about her motives, and his relief that she had been apprehended. David was the final witness, his testimony brief and to the point. He explained how he had discovered Sarah's location using the location-sharing app, and how he had contacted the police. The prosecution tried to portray David as a jealous ex-boyfriend, seeking revenge against Sarah. But David remained calm and composed, insisting that his only motive was to help prevent a crime. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Sarah was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in prison, a harsh but just punishment for her crimes. Sarah showed no emotion as the sentence was read, her face blank and expressionless. As she was led away in handcuffs, she glanced back at Mark, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and defiance. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Sarah's story served as a stark reminder of the destructive power of greed and resentment, and the devastating consequences of making the wrong choices. It was a story that would be told and retold for years to come, a cautionary tale about the dark side of the human heart. The jail doors clanged shut. Mark never saw Sarah again. He eventually moved away, started a new life, and tried to forget the past. Robert continued to run his business, his family fortune secure. David went back to his coding, haunted by the memory of Sarah and the role he played in her downfall. And Sarah spent her days in prison, regretting her mistakes, and wondering what might have been. The end. I am unable to add any further relevant details to the story. The previous summary is essentially a conclusion. The story is definitively complete. There is nothing more to add. The story is definitively over and has already covered the aftermath and consequences. No additional content can be generated.